Hey everyone. So this is going to be a bit of a longer devlog, so I'll keep this introduction short and sweet. But I'll start by saying this. 5 years ago today was the day that Chiaroscuro was successfully funded on Kickstarter, and I just want to start by saying thank you all for all of the support you guys have shown me throughout all this time. It's been an absolute dream to be able to build this project into what it's become, and that's all thanks to you guys. And now, onto the video. Let's talk combat. For anyone who has played Chiaroscuro, you know that its battling mechanics are the key aspect of the game that allows players to conquer boss fights and other challenges throughout their adventure. It was one of the first features I added to the game back in 2020, and despite making some small adjustments to it throughout the course of the game's development, most of that code was done when I was just starting off. It wouldn't be far off to say that a lot of the scripts I made for the game's combat early on were held together by an Elmer's glue stick. With that said, since Chiaroscuro's combat pace has increased significantly over the last few years, I figured I'd revisit its combat and make some changes. These changes make the game feel more responsive and rewarding to play than ever before, so let's talk about them. The first of these changes has to do with the Thorn, Rose's primary physical weapon. I started by increasing the Thorn's attack speed by a small margin, and also made it so that you move forward at a more consistent rate when attacking. There were a few other small changes I made as well, including increasing the balance height of the pogo mechanic and also making it so that when you hold up, you don't get knocked back when attacking. These changes made using the Thorn feel more consistent with its combos and overall DPS. Another weapon that I buffed significantly more than the Thorn was the bow. Throughout the beta testing, I realized that the bow is a significantly underutilized weapon due to its slow charge speed and low damage output. To fix this, I cut the speed at which it takes to charge the bow in half. I also increased the speed of the arrow that it shoots. These small changes balance the bow to make it about as useful as the base Thorn. Its DPS is not as fast as the Thorn's, but its solid range and faster charge time make it much more worthwhile to use than before. Now let's talk about the elemental spells. These are some of the most useful abilities that Rose gets throughout the course of her adventure. Most of these abilities were unchanged or even nerfed to better balance the combat. I'll go over how these spells work and what changes were made to them if applicable. First we'll cover the Lumen Slash. One thing I noted from the players during the beta was that the Lumen Slash was by far the most overpowered ability in the entire game due to its status effect, stunning enemies. Unsurprisingly, the ability to stun enemies is incredibly strong, especially against bosses. The way the stun status effect works is that when an enemy is stunned, they will remain stunned for a few seconds before regaining their senses. If an enemy is hit, however, they'll be knocked out of this stunned state. What made this status effect so powerful during boss fights was that if a boss was stunned during an attack's telegraph, their attack would be stopped, making them reevaluate which move to use on the player and giving the player more time to reassess their situation. I decided this status effect was far too powerful for the Lumen Slash ability, so I removed the effect from the spell. There is another way to stun enemies, but the new method takes a little more work. I'll get to that later in the video. So then what does the Lumen Slash have to offer without its stun status effect then? While it only deals 1.5 times your Thorn's damage, which is low compared to the other elemental spells, it has the fastest execution speed for any spell in the game, making it a beast for raw DPS. I think this is fair for it being the first spell you acquire, and the fact that it has good range and a fast strike makes it still a great spell to use overall. Now onto the Spirit Blast. This spell is mostly unchanged, but I'll cover it in the other spells anyway as a recap. For this ability, Rose shoots out a large projectile that deals 3 times your Thorn's damage on contact, the most damage of any elemental spell. However, this projectile splits into 3 projectiles after a certain amount of time, with each of these smaller projectiles dealing damage equivalent to your Thorn's damage. Spirit Blast status effect is Knockback, which does exactly what it sounds like. While this spell is relatively slow, it provides the player with decent damage and keeps enemies at bay. This is great since Spirit is more of a defensive element anyway. The Ruby Missile spell allows Rose to shoot out a fast missile horizontally. This spell not only has great range, but it also has good damage, with each missile dealing 2 times the player's Thorn damage on contact. Ruby attacks also offer a unique status effect called Absorption, where successful attacks will pierce enemies and drain them of their lumen. This means that each Ruby attack dealt will yield a little extra lumen. The Gamma Burst spell allows Rose to shoot out an arc-based projectile that deals 2 times the player's Thorn damage on contact. While this spell is not as fast as the Ruby Missile or the Lumen Slash, it creates a puddle of gamma wherever it lands. If an enemy either gets hit by a gamma attack or touches the puddle, they'll be inflicted with the poison status effect. The way that poison works in Chiaroscuro is that if an enemy is poisoned, they will take 25% more damage from all successive attacks for 5 seconds. This allows Gamma to be more of a support element, while also giving it a niche that the other elements don't offer. The Velocity Shuriken spell allows Rose to shoot out a projectile that moves on a sine wave, and deals 2 times the player's thorn damage. This spell is unique because it's the only projectile in the game that can go through walls. In addition, it can also go through enemies, and, like the Spirit Blast, has the knockback status effect. This projectile's interesting movement and unique collision interaction make it a very well-rounded spell compared to others. The Aquasphere spell allows Rose to shoot out a horizontal projectile that deals 2 times the player's thorn damage on contact. While this spell is slower than most other elemental projectiles, what makes this ability great is its Drain status effect, unique to the Aqua element. Drain is arguably the best secondary effect of any element in the game due to its regenerative effects. If the player is full health and successfully lands an Aqua-based attack, they will receive up to 2 temporary hit points. If the player switches to another element, one of these hit points will go away, meaning that it's possible to rack up 2 temporary hit points and switch to another element, keeping one of the extra hit points upon changing elements. If the player is not at full health and lands a successful Aqua-based attack, their health regeneration bar will increase instead. The Static Orb spell allows Rose to shoot out a horizontal projectile that deals 2 times the player's thorn damage on contact. This spell has by far the best range of any projectile and is relatively quick, though what makes this spell stand out is its unique interaction with the player's thorn. If this projectile is shot, the player's thorn swing will determine the direction the projectile goes, allowing for the Static Orb to hit enemies around corners or in awkward positions. The player is also able to summon this spell back towards them, and with the right timing, one can actually pogo off their own projectile. The Plasma Grenade spell allows Rose to shoot out an arc-based projectile that deals 2 times the player's thorn damage on contact. This projectile's size is smaller compared to the other elemental spells, but what makes this spell unique is that when it either touches a wall or lands on an enemy, it will explode. This explosion has a large hitbox and also deals the player's thorn damage upon being hit by the blast. That means if the player hits an enemy with a plasma grenade, that enemy will get dealt 3 times the player's thorn damage upon contact. The last of the elemental spells I'll be covering is the Dream Boomerang. This spell allows Rose to shoot out a projectile that will return to the player after going a certain distance, that is, unless it hits a wall, in which case the projectile gets destroyed. Like the Velocity Shuriken, this spell goes through enemies and deals 1.25 times the player's thorn damage on contact. Enemies can also get hurt a second time when the boomerang is returning to the player, meaning that if an enemy gets hit twice by this spell, it will deal 2.5 times the player's thorn damage in total. This spell can also be shot at an angle by holding either up or down while releasing the projectile, making it great for dealing with aerial enemies. And that covers all the elemental spells, but those aren't all of the abilities I will be covering in this video. If you remember back when the Kickstarter was funded back in October of 2020, I mentioned Rose having elemental strikes as well. These are variations of the Thorn attack that deal elemental damage based on which element you have equipped, and each one has unique interactions with enemies that make them stand out compared to the regular Thorn attack. So without further ado, let's talk about them. Let's go down the list of elements like I did for the spells, but discuss the strikes instead. Now, something to note about the elemental strikes is that if you land a successful attack with an elemental strike, it will work similarly to your Thorn, where you will get some lumen back. However, since these strikes cost lumen to use, you will only get back half of a lumen upon attacking rather than getting a full lumen. Elemental strikes also count as physical attacks, meaning landing one provides a chance for a critical hit. Critical hits multiply your damage by 1.5, with the default chance of landing a crit being 1 in 12, making strikes much more effective for raw damage compared to spells. The first elemental strike I will be discussing is the Lumen Headbutt. This strike is a variation of the regular dash ability. The dash costs 1/8 of a lumen to use and renders the player completely invulnerable, while the Lumen Headbutt costs half of a lumen to use and deals damage to an enemy upon contact. If the player headbutts an enemy, they will get sent into a backflip. which allows the player to pivot and reassess their situation. The Lumen Headbutt is a very useful strike in that since it only costs half of a lumen to use and you receive half of a lumen upon contact with an enemy, you can essentially use it over and over and not lose lumen. The Lumen Headbutt also deals twice your thorn damage, making it a very reliable ability. In addition, this move also acts as a secondary dash that you can use continuously as long as you have lumen, making it great for aerial movement compared to the normal dash. For the Spirit element, rather than having an elemental strike, it actually has a more defensive ability, a shield. The Spirit Shield costs half of a lumen to activate, and blocks damage from all attacks, but stops the player from moving entirely. If the player successfully blocks an attack, they will not only be sent into a backflip to pivot, but they will also gain back half of a lumen, and they will deal twice the player's thorn damage to an enemy if it makes contact with the shield. This makes the Spirit Shield not only a great way of protecting the player from damage, but also rewards the player for blocking an attack by damaging the opponent and rewarding the player by compensating the lumen used from activating the shield. The Ruby element gives player access to the Ruby Slash ability. This elemental strike costs 1 lumen to use and has an attack speed roughly equal to the player's regular Thorn Slash. However, it has a much larger hitbox and deals twice the player's thorn damage. In addition, with this being a Ruby attack, it also grants the absorption status effect upon landing a successful hit, meaning that instead of gaining half of a lumen upon making contact with an enemy, the player will gain 3/4 of their lumen back. This makes the Ruby Strike a very consistent attack in terms of range, damage, and usability. The Gamma element gives the player access to the Gamma Fangs ability. This elemental strike costs 1 lumen to use and has the fastest attack speed of any ability in the game, in addition to dealing twice the player's thorn damage. With that said, however, it has by far the smallest hitbox of all of the strikes, including the base thorn. With this being a Gamma attack, it also deals the poison status effect upon landing a successful hit, meaning that for 5 seconds, any successive attacks will deal 25% more damage, including attacks from the base thorn, the bow, or other elemental abilities. This makes the Gamma Fangs by far the best ability in terms of raw DPS. With its incredible damage output, but small hitbox, it makes this strike a very risk-reward ability. I can see speedrunners making great use of the Gamma Fangs to absolutely tear bosses apart. The Gale element gives the player access to the Gale Dash ability. This elemental strike costs 1 lumen to use and deals twice the player's thorn damage. This ability shoots the player up or down at a 45-degree angle depending on whether they are either holding up or down while performing the strike. The Gale Dash can also be used in the air, making it not only useful for combat but also for aerial mobility. What makes this attack different from other abilities is that the player can go through enemies and remain invulnerable. This is similar to a few other elemental strikes I will discuss later in the video, but what makes the Gale Dash unique is the significant distance at which the player gets launched when using this ability. The player will also be granted a small number of invincibility frames after using this attack, which keeps the player from immediately taking damage after colliding with an enemy. This attack can be comboed with the regular Thorn Pogo attack to keep the player from losing lumen, as shown here. All in all, the Gale Dash is useful not only for its mobility, but also for its combo potential and invulnerability from attacks. The Aqua element gives the player access to the Aqua Whip ability. This elemental strike costs 1 lumen to use and deals twice the player's thorn damage. This ability has a much slower attack speed than any of the other physical attacks, but what makes this strike stand out is its long attacking range and the drain status effect that it offers. This is the same status effect granted from using the Aqua Sphere, but in a physical attack instead. With that said, while the Aqua Whip doesn't have incredible DPS, its incredibly large hitbox and regenerative capabilities make it one of the most reliable elemental abilities in the game. The Static element gives the player access to 2 different abilities, the first of which is the Static Roll. This elemental strike costs 1 lumen to activate and deals twice the player's thorn damage upon contact with an enemy. This ability is arguably the best method of ground-based mobility in the entire game, making it great for getting around the map quickly. Running into an enemy will also send the player into a backflip state, which, in addition to pivoting, will put the player in a position to combo into the other ability this element offers, the Static Flip. The static flip is one of the more interesting attacks due to its unique movement. This elemental strike costs 1 lumen to activate and will summon a lightning bolt underneath the player at the apex of their jump. If this lightning bolt touches the ground, it will create an explosion of electricity, which also damages enemies. Both the bolts of lightning and the explosion deal 1.5 times the player's thorn damage, which means that if the player manages to successfully land an attack with both the bolt of lightning and the explosion, their strike will deal 3 times the player's thorn damage, making it the strongest elemental strike in the game. With that said, however, it's probably the trickiest attack to accurately strike. Similar to the Gale Dash, the player will become invulnerable to attacks during the flip, making it a little safer to execute than it would be otherwise. The player can also cancel both the static roll and the static flip by letting go of the left trigger, which is the elemental trigger for those who haven't played Chiaroscuro. As you can tell, both of the static element strikes are rewarding for their own reasons, with the static roll being great for mobility and the static flip being a reliable way to flank enemies while dishing out solid damage. The plasma element gives the player access to 2 different attacks as well, both of which are variations of the plasma kick ability. The plasma kick can either be executed up or down, depending on the direction held during the attack. Both of these abilities cost 1 lumen to use and deal twice the player's thorn damage, but they have 2 completely different uses. Using the plasma kick up will cause the player to leap into the air and kick enemies upward alongside them. This attack can be chained over and over and act almost like another double jump. Using the plasma kick down will cause the player to dash at a downward angle to damage enemies beneath them. This ability is pretty similar to Hornet's down slash in Hollow Knight's Silksong. With that said, this ability was actually implemented before I saw that Hornet had this mechanic, so Rose having this attack as well was a bit of a happy accident considering people seem to really like Silksong's unique pogo. Landing a successful hit with the plasma kick down will send the player into a backflip position, allowing them to either chain this attack again or pivot to using another ability. Something to note about the plasma element is that the player's critical hit rate will be doubled when using this element. This passive also takes effect for the player's base thorn as well, making the plasma element great for farming damage from critical hits. With this, the plasma kick is a great strike for dealing damage up close while also offering the player some interesting mobility options. Lastly, the Dream element gives the player access to the Dream Rift ability. The Dream Rift is the weakest of the elemental strikes, only dealing 1.5 times the player's thorn damage with a cost of 1 lumen to use, but its low attack damage is made up for its sheer versatility. This attack causes Rose to not only become invulnerable to attacks, but it can also be used as a multi-directional dash that can be used on the ground and in the air, while also damaging enemies you go through. It's essentially the Gale Dash, if it were less powerful and with less travel distance, but instead of dashing diagonally, you can dash in any direction you want. The fact that this strike has a quick attack speed, gives access to invulnerability, and great mobility options, the Dream Rift is arguably the most well-rounded ability in the entire game. That covers all the elemental strikes and what they can do. Now let's talk about how you can use them together. I mentioned earlier in the video that the way you stun enemies has changed, and that adjustment was made with the implementation of elemental strikes. To encourage players to use these abilities in tandem with one another, you are now able to stun enemies by successfully chaining elemental attacks into a unique 3-hit combo. There are multiple ways you can trigger this combo, but the most reliable methods are using either the Plasma, Static, or Gale abilities, since each of these elements offers 2 unique moves that count as different kinds of strikes in the combo. The stun combo won't work if you use 2 Aqua Whip attacks in a row and then finish it off with another strike, but the combo will work if you use the Plasma Kick up, Plasma Kick down, and then another ability. Players are given a 1.5 second grace period between strikes to execute a new attack in the combo, so I'm curious to see what kind of chain attacks you all will be able to come up with upon the game's release. And that's about it for the devlog. I hope you all enjoyed this showcase of Chiaroscuro's new combat system, and I'd love to hear what you all think in the comments below. If you're interested in following the game's development, join the Chiaroscuro Discord and wishlist the game on Steam so you'll know when it releases. Links will be provided in the description below. Anyway, thank you all for watching, and I'll see you all in the next one. Sayonara.